friends, and welcome to Happy Brain, Happy Life. My name is Dr. Mireli Saponte, Dr. Mimi, for many of you that already follow everything we teach about the brain. And we want to make sure that you learn easy, practical strategies of brain health so you can think, feel, and act better, faster, so you can accomplish your goals and your dreams. Okay. And so having a happy brain is really going to take you forward into your goals. And I want to talk today about a very particular topic. And have you ever wondered, like, how come some people look like or act as responsible and others don't? Like, where have they learned their sense of responsibility? Have you ever thought about that? Um, and so your brain is completely responsible for this. And I want to teach you because it's interesting how we are able to learn responsibility, even though our surroundings and the things around in our environment might have taught us differently in the past. If we're able to understand the brain, we're able to change this around. And so maybe you want to be more accountable on things. Maybe you feel like you want to be more reliable. Maybe you've struggled with this in the past and have been looking for ways to improve in this area. Or you're overly responsible, right? Like you feel like your sense of responsibility is so high that sometimes you feel you can't fail at anything because your sense of responsibility is way too, too radical. Then let's talk about how the brain interprets all of this, okay? And so today, let's think about responsibility. So, what is it, right? And it's really the ability to reliably fulfill commitments, okay? By making what sound decisions, accepting accountability of one's own actions. So, one thing about responsibility is that it has nothing to do with somebody else, but it has to do with me and my own decisions. And am I reliable? Am I accountable, right? So, it's fundamental to both personal well being, but also to our social functioning. Because when we learn and we see somebody that's not responsible on something, what do? Oh, we push them either away or we end up making judgments, right, about people's decision making. So it's important and it's crucial ability for us humans to participate in community, participate at job, both in our career and in our personal life. Responsibility is a very important role. And so while often is discussed as a moral, kind of more philosophical context, responsibility really has a distinct neurobiological underpinnings, okay, that can be understood, they can be measured, but we also are able to enhance it. Through different interventions, right? We can use strategies to improve our responsibility. Have you ever thought about that? We always think it as a moral kind of philosophical thing. Oh, he's just or she is not responsible. However, we are able to apply strategies to help our brain kind of become more accountable and more connected to our goals and to the things that we want to accomplish. So today we're going to explore that neuroscience behind responsibility. We're going to explore which brain regions are associated and involved, and also how to develop a sense of compromise, right? What happens when these areas of the brain are affected, and more importantly, how can we strengthen those networks so that we're able to be better decision makers and way more accountable? So let's think about this, our responsible brain, right? So let's think about the structures that are related to it. And it's interesting because it's not just one structure, it is a coordination of activity between different brain regions. So, for example, one of the first that I'm going to mention, and you've heard me talk about this before, is our prefrontal cortex, right? And so our prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral and ventromedial regions, which means kind of like our our lateral regions of the prefrontal cortex are responsible for behavior. And there are studies that demonstrate how all of this is orchestrated, but executive functions, which is our planning, our prioritizing, our organizing actions, are there. Our impulse control, as such as, like, inhibiting inappropriate responses, like zipping it and locking it before thinking before talking, right? Prospective thinking, so kind of anticipating the consequences of our actions, are also in the prefrontal cortex. And also a value-based decision making, which means really weighing costs and benefits. So if I do this, what would happen? If I do that, what would happen, right? So kind of weighing it in. And so that prefrontal cortex is really the last brain region that to fully mature on any human being, and the expectation is that it really happens in the mid 20s. So when we are thinking that high school students and college students can just be completely on their own and make their own decisions, yes, we're throwing them into the world. Unfortunately, we're throwing into the world brains that are still not mature enough. And so we have to be conscious about this, because responsibility tends to increase really with age. And so, not that they cannot be responsible before this, but understand that those thought processes and decision making processes in the prefrontal cortex are still not mature enough, not secure enough, haven't made all of the all the conclusions, let's put it that way, to make consistent good decisions. And so that's why sometimes you'll have a very good, you'll say, oh, this person, this young man or woman, all of a sudden making such a radical or rash decision, has a lot to do with their brain and not necessarily to do with a social or moral judgment. It was their ability to think and make decisions and judge that before they made that bad decision. And so a very key area that is involved in this. Also, there's a region called the anterior cingulate cortex, and it functions as a conflict monitor, right? So there's studies about this. Botvinnik did some studies back in the 2000s, where we detect conflicts between competing responses, and we're able to send signals, right? The brain sends signals when behavior deviates from goals or expectations. So kind of like a way of letting you know, hey, 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 you're away from from what you wanted to achieve. And so it actually helps facilitate learning from the mistakes, which is one key area that we are not using enough in the education system. So we have, for the past almost 100 years in education, have been um, putting the mistakes as something that should never happen, right? So we cross them off with red, we make really negative marks, we put a negative on everything. Now we don't have just A, B, C, D, right? We have an F, right? We have a positive A or a negative A. So even an A can be positive or negative. Who even invented that? That's like such off the brain and totally opposite to good developing brain. And we still use these systems all over, all the way to college. And so when I hear somebody tell me, oh no, I got a minus, I can't get a minus A. What? I mean, like, what are you talking about, right? So unfortunately, that is completely against what the brain would understand as a growing and maturing opportunity. And it is detrimental, guys. It is detrimental to our brains. It's the reason why we continue to have increasing levels of mental illness and mental disabilities, because we are just teaching the brain not to mature, but to be in constant conflict with itself. And so, if we were to use it properly, we would be facilitating learning from mistakes. Making as many mistakes as possible is what really creates lots of learning, and being positive about making mistakes. And we have taken this into the workplace as well. So it is something that we haven't really learned from literature, because this is literature back from even the 2000s. So it's not like we don't have enough information for the past 20, 30 years to be able to make rational, better decisions now, okay? And the anterior cingulate also plays a key role in the outcome evaluation, right? So the ability for us to be able to evaluate something that has happened and then make a decision moving forward is also in the anterior cingulate. Now we also have a structure that's called the insula, right? It integrates internal signals with external information. It's like it processes emotion responses, right? So to potential outcomes. So if I respond like this is what will happen, right? And it contributes to empathy and understanding how our actions affect others. So the insula really helps us measure if I were to just scream out loud, like if us parents, a kid falls and we immediately go into the shouting mode or into the screaming mode and the running crazy kind of mode versus the let me wait and look what happened, right? We would be understanding how our actions affect others and how we're teaching more fear than picking ourselves up from a mistake or from a fall. And so it really helps us with that gut feeling as well. It's like that perception, that guide for responsible choices, for do I play the safe role and use safety first versus do I just risk it and don't care, right? So that gut feeling is right there. There's also the temporoparietal junction, which is actually, it's kind of like right up here, right? And it's a junction between our frontal lobe and our parietal lobe. And that junction right there is an area that helps us with the perspective of taking, taking and theory of mind, kind of thinking, how do we understand our own thoughts? How do we put those together? Do we think about this way, but I have my own thoughts about it, and how do I put those two together? And then it also helps us distinguish between self and others. So it's okay for me to feel this way about this versus other people feeling or thinking different, right? Or thinking or feeling, experiencing different. There's moral reasoning is in that sector of the brain right there in the middle. And what our actions and our consequences can be. And then there's also the limbic system, right? So our limbic system, many of you have heard about it. Maybe I've mentioned so many areas that you've never heard about before. But in the limbic system, including our amygdala and our nucleus accumbens, this is a very internal substructure, right? Very small area of the brain, but it generates emotional responses. It's the one that, the famous fight or flight, right? It informs and makes decisions about the environment and what we are seeing and what we are deciding upon, anything that can be coming to us. And so it's really responsible for behavior because it gives us a reward signal. If is this something that I should be feel happy about? Is this something that I should be fearing, right? And this is why we can actually train the amygdala to be quiet, because the amygdala typically would be in a position to protect us all the time. And so that's why sometimes we won't move towards our goals, because the amygdala is constantly saying, hey, remember, you haven't been successful in the past. Doesn't mean this time you're going to be successful. So, be fearful of that test, be fearful of that process, be fearful of that promotion, or even, applying for that job or applying for this proposal or applying. I mean, it's the one that kind of guards you a little bit. And so it really guides into our future actions. So area that can be, and it's been studied for so many years, so it's contradictory that we are not living with this knowledge in mind. And last but not least, I want to tell you, excuse me, I want to tell you about our neurochemistry, right? So I talk about this all the time, but it's important to understand that when our structures are there, if they are healthy, they are interconnecting properly. That means signals are being sent back and forth, and we can teach it. We can expose ourselves to the proper thinking, actions, so that we are constantly creating new neural networks. However, our chemistry needs to be in the right place. This is why hydration, exercise, I mean, all of these areas, nutrition, right, sleep, physical activity, all of this needs to be in place for our neurochemistry to be in equilibrium, or what I call, and this is what I call my book, homeostasis. Because if it's working properly, then our neurochemistry is helping our our signals just be able to be sent to the right areas in the right moment and produced properly. And so you have the dopamine. Dopamine really reinforces behavior through reward pathways. So we feel good when we've won, but then if we only feed the negative, then we're also feeding a reward in the failure. And so we don't want to do that, right? We want to be able to maintain the focus for long-term goals. We want to be able to hijack, addiction to processes, or addiction in period. So it's very important to understand that dopamine plays a big role in what? In responsibility, right? Dopamine plays a big role in saying, okay, if I do this constantly this way, I'm gonna feel good about it, right? I'm gonna feel success. I'm gonna feel consistently moving and achieving forward. So another neurotransmitter is serotonin, and this one really regulates our impulsivity and self-control, which is very important because it influences our moral judgment, but also our pro-social behavior, right? So serotonin helps us be in the proper, in the proper ability to have good relationships, to connect with others, to connect with myself so I can connect with others. And so it affects our mood, but also it impacts the decision, my decision quality, right? So it helps me understand what is my current affect to make decisions. If I don't have a good mood, what happens? I make really wrong decisions, right? Have you ever had that? Like, you've had a bad day, you're in a bad mood, you created this whole bad mood about something that was not going great, and all of a sudden, all the decisions during that day are not great, guys. So we have to be able to regulate our serotonin many ways to do that effectively. Now, norepinephrine is another one that modulates our level of attention, alertness, and it's necessary to be consistently responsible. Let's put it that way, right? So it's consistent. Our consistent performance is due to norepinephrine, and it helps maintain vigilance, and our attention to task completion. So, can you start seeing the role between our brain and responsibility? Yes. And last but not least, I want to mention oxytocin, which promotes really trust and social bonding. And so it is so important for everything that we do to be able to be seen as responsible, but also to feel good as being responsible in creating those relationships and that trust that we will always be there, right? So oxytocin, very easy one to maintain in good levels if we are accompanied, right? If we keep good relationships with people, if we keep close to the ones that we love, and if we don't have anybody that we love close by, you know what? There's so many ways of releasing oxytocin, even with a pet. I've talked about this one before. You can look at that lesson later and take a focus on it, right? Take a review of it. Now, there's plenty of cases that can show us, that this is true. Phineas Cage was one of the first ones that we ever study in neuroscience, because it's a very old case in the 1848, something like that, I believe. And then it was published. There's so many publications about it, but where an accident produced damage to the frontal lobe, and it really shows how that frontal lobe area is so related to responsibility and who we are and how we respond to things. Now, can we learn this from the environment? Of course we can. We can learn it from the people around us. However, your brain is going to take it from different perspectives. And so we always can retrain and improve it. Now, we can also be in a role where if you were overly responsible, you can be in the role of addicting the reward system in a negative way. Unless you're responsible, you won't be seen as a good person, unless you are, like, so we have to be very careful where we're at, and that we accomplish it by being aware. Right, and developing a sense of awareness of who we are, how we do it, how we move, how we're making decisions. It all is going to start with one thing, and it's the decision. And that decision is called awareness, right? A sense and level of awareness. I want to be able to evaluate where my sense of responsibility is. I want to be able to think, which is one of the hardest skills you'll ever develop, is a sense of awareness. Be able to be conscious about what's going on, what you're thinking without judgment, and then make new decisions. Now, there's a number of neuropsychiatric conditions that affect responsibility. One of them you certainly know about it, you've heard about it, is the attention deficit disorder. And this affects, honestly, 5 to 7% of children and 2 to 3% of adults. And why less adults than children? Because many haven't been diagnosed yet. Lots of people self-diagnosing those, so be mindful of that. But there is a reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex for this condition. And so all of these areas related to responsibility kind of are lowered. So, for example, dopamine and norepinephrine transmissions have abnormalities typically on people with ADHD, and there's just altered activity. There's many others, such as addictions, hypersensitivity to drugs, hypersensitivity to natural rewards. There's impaired prefrontal cortex regulations. There's frontotemporal dementias related to this. There's antisocial personality disorder also related to this. So plenty of neuro psychiatric conditions related to a role in responsibility. Now, how do we develop, right, responsibility? Obviously, in the early childhood is key, from 2 to 5 year olds. Now, not before that, because the brain is still making basic connections before 2 years old. But I can tell you that by the time that they are biped, that means standing up, and I teach a lot about this in any of my training for teachers, parents, all of that, is that once they are standing in their own 2 feet, we are able to connect, neurons to that prefrontal cortex. That's when the prefrontal cortex is starting to make connections to, the world, and the things that are, that are the yes and the no's, right? The what should I or shouldn't be doing. So if before then you're just, bombarding these brains with the yes and the no, and you can't, and you can't, and you can't, be mindful. What you are creating with that is a very negative, consistent negative outcome. So early childhood to 2 to 5 years old, it's very important to emerge. There's self-regulation at this time. There's beginning of awareness and rules and consequences that can be taught lightly and simply. Middle age, middle school age, so 6 to 11 years old, there's some internalization of these rules already, and there's more impulse control. There's greater understanding of the cause and effect at this point. And then by adolescence, now where risk taking increases because it's heightened, right? And so there is that peer influence that strongly shapes what responsible versus irresponsible choices, right? So adolescence is key, but the first two stages were super important for kind of molding that prefrontal cortex. Now, this doesn't mean, sometimes you say, but he was such a good kid before in that adolescence, so many things change. Well, understand there's a whole bunch of change in the neurochemistry during adolescence, right? Because of puberty. So greater capacity for long-term planning emerges, but however, there's that shaping of responsibility right in the middle of adolescence, and everything from before, in addition to good brain health during this time, is really going to help kind of set that foundation for responsibility. And then young adulthood, 18 to 25, is continued maturation of the prefrontal cortex and also integration of the emotions and cognition. So that can improve during the young adult years. And so responsibility starts to stabilize, and you can see it as their career and their life choices at this point have developed. And there's even longitudinal studies. There's a study by Casey in 2019 that tracked brain development and responsible decision making across adolescents, and finding that really maturation connections were predicted, as increased in responsible behavior better than just age alone. So it's important to understand the maturation of that brain. It's really towards the 18 to 25 years of age. So no, when we kick them out, right? And it's different in different cultures, because in the Latino culture we try to keep them a little longer. Let's put it that way, but we are really risking their solidification of their decision making. So we can think of better ways to help them during these stages as we promote their independence and their living successfully in the world. Okay, so there's plenty of cognitive training interventions. We can do working memory training. We can implement intention strategies, which is one that I love because we really plan. So a lot of if and then strategies. This one is very important to me because you really can plan out thought. And we need to teach thinking from an early stage. This is why I love one of the programs that we have in the Empower Living community is called Journey of Action. And it's a curriculum that we run for youth to develop not only thought, but thinking skills, leadership skills, all the way from those 2 to 5 year olds till the young adulthood age, and it goes so well with brain development. So if you have any questions about Journey of Action, just write in the comment Journey of Action. I would love to send you more information how we can get that to your community, how we can bring some of this training to you, to your youth groups directly, but also to the adults that want to work with the youth. So make sure you connect with us, because I think responsibility starts early. However, I don't want you to give up. You might be an adult watching this and saying, well, what about me? Now, what do I do? Well, the way that you're going to work with it now is implementing brain health techniques for yourself. But in addition, now you're going to be develop that sense of consciousness about it, so that we can evaluate where you've been, where you're at, and so how can you change your outcome now moving forward. Mindfulness and meditation are other of the strategies that we use for it, and cognitive behavioral approaches are fantastic to help change our thoughts, to help change our automatic thinking into a more productive thinking. And so we can retrain this. There's so many ways and positive ways. We can increase your sleep optimization. We can increase your brain health by improving your dopamine levels and improving your serotonin levels and improving so many things that maybe unconsciously have not necessarily worked out for you up until now. So take a decision today, make a conscious decision today. Is this an area that I would need some support or actions taken? Is this an area that I need to improve? Is this an area that I could get better at? Maybe you're already a responsible person, but you see it as a compromise and not as something that is just intrinsic from you, just it comes naturally from you, but more of an obligation. So let's see how we can really make your brain happier by transforming responsibility in you and the people around you, because this is certainly something that you can teach other. If you're a parent, a grandparent, an uncle, an aunt, if you have young people around you, this is one area that you can certainly start improving today. So reach out, make a comment, ask me questions. I would love to help you out. Hope this information has helped you some today in changing your perspective on responsibility and how your brain is so involved in the way you think, feel, and act as a responsible person in this world, and how you can impact others in helping build their own. Hope you have some time today to think about this for yourself, create some awareness, and share with others. Hope to see you on the next